As I've mentioned before, sometimes it's the things that we don't say that carry the most meaning. We call this nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication consists of a wide range of things, from the way you dress, your hairstyle, whether you have tattoos, to the way you move, and how much space you require. Body language is one component of nonverbal communication, and this is sometimes referred to as kinesics. Kinesics is the most studied area of nonverbal communication. It includes everything from walking, sitting, standing, your posture, your facial expressions, your eye contact, and of course, all the movements you make with your arms, head, feet, legs, and so forth. In many cases, we rely on subtle cues, especially facial expressions, to tell what a person is really thinking, especially in election years. However, gestures don't always translate very well from culture to culture, and that's why you have to be careful in business or traveling in order to avoid misunderstandings. In one study in Israel, college students from 14 different cultural backgrounds were asked to interpret Ethiopian immigrant gestures, and it turned out that those students misinterpreted the gestures 70% of the time. Emblems are nonverbal acts with specific meanings. They're kind of like words in that sense. They have specific meanings. So, for example, the OK sign in the United States obviously means all right, but in France it means worthless. In Japan it refers to coin, to money, and in Germany it's an insult, meaning something like butthole. And of course, the thumbs up sign is a positive sign in the United States. In Germany, it means the number 1. In Japan, the number 5. In Malaysia, it's used to point to things. But in Ghana and many other places, it's an insult. A former student of mine traveled all over Europe asking locals to take his photograph near monuments where he would give the thumbs up sign. And only later did he discover that he was making a rude gesture in many of those places. And even diplomats like Bill Richardson make these mistakes. He showed the bottom of his shoe to Saddam Hussein, which infuriated Saddam Hussein because you're not supposed to show anyone the bottom of your foot because it's considered dirty and insulting. And we're all familiar with these emblems, right? The hitchhiking emblem, again, you need to be careful where you use this because otherwise you might be standing by the side of the road telling people something really rather insulting. Talk to the hand. Politicians are favorite targets for, abusive emblems because they have to be hyper aware, especially when dealing with foreign affairs. And of course, here's the, it's either the shout at the devil kind of sign or it's hook 'em horns for the Aggies. And of course, the extended middle finger qualifies as an emblem. It has a discrete meaning. Illustrators, on the other hand, clarify what is being said. So, you might indicate with your hands how big something is, or you might move your hand at the pace that something you're talking about is moving. Illustrators are a little like onomatopoeia in that way, in that the gesture actually resembles the thing that you're trying to convey. Regulators regulate the flow of conversation, and these include things like eye movement, crossing your arms, taking a step forward or a step back, nodding your head of approval. And when you think about it, you have to be constantly aware of when the other person is finished talking and when it's your turn to talk. And finally, adapters are things that we do unconsciously that make us feel more comfortable. And these are things like scratching our arms, playing with hair, jingling our keys in our pocket, whatever it is. These allow us to adapt to different situations and make us feel comfortable. We talked about how emblems can be difficult to understand if you're not familiar with them. And yet affect displays or facial expressions, at least some of them, are universal. So affect displays are facial expressions that convey the real or the fake emotional state of the communicator. The idea that some expressions are universal isn't a new one. So Aristotle said there are characteristic facial expressions which are observed to accompany anger, fear, erotic excitement, and all the other passions. And Darwin had a similar observations in his travels on the Beagle in the mid-1800s. And we often rely on our sense of what a person is like and what their motivations are from facial expression alone, even in very serious matters. So, George W. Bush said of Vladimir Putin, "I looked the man in the eye. I found him to be very straightforward and trustworthy. We had a very good dialogue. I was able to get a sense of his soul." A very simple but classic study demonstrated the universality of certain facial expressions. Ekman and Friesen recounted a story to foray participants of New Guinea and asked them which facial expressions in a set of 3 photographs depicted the face of the protagonist of the story. Ekman and Friesen found that anger, surprise, disgust, sadness, happiness, and fear were interpreted by the foray of Highland New Guinea in the same way as Americans. And they tried the same experiment with American college students as well. So the foray participants were asked to pose the faces they associated with certain emotions, and the American students were correctly able to identify those emotions. And this study is important because the foray had very little contact with Westerners, and so it was ensured that they weren't just using their knowledge of Western facial expressions to give the correct answer. Another really important indication that some facial expressions or some affect displays are universal is that blind children produce facial expressions like smiling when they are very young that are very similar to what sighted children produce, suggesting that they're not imitating these facial expressions and that they arise innately. Another intriguing bit of evidence for universality in facial expressions is that humans and other primates appear to use similar signals for enjoyment, distress, threat, and submission. And of course, people have a field day with this sort of thing when it comes to politicians. I'm not picking on George W. Bush here, it just happens to be what's out there. Really, you could do this with any politician, or really any person. Smiles are perhaps the most fascinating of all facial expressions, being talked about by great writers like Shakespeare, in children's stories, and one of the most famous paintings of all is about the meaning of a smile. Because of the complexity of smiles, Ekman and Friesen came up with a system of documenting facial expressions systematically by actually recording the movement of individual muscles and the duration and timing of that muscle activation. And they called this the Facial Action Coding System, or FACS. And they found that different muscles are activated in felt or genuine smiles versus false smiles. These muscles here on the left are activated in felt or genuine smiles, but not activated in fake smiles. Ekman and Friesen argued that false smiles can be distinguished from genuine smiles. These false smiles, they argue, involve different muscles, as we talked about, and are also more asymmetrical and last longer than genuine smiles. And most interesting of all, there really are different types of smiles in terms of brain activity. So genuine smiles are produced by the limbic system rather than the motor cortex. So patients with limbic damage can't actually produce a spontaneous, genuine smile. In contrast, patients with motor damage can't produce a false smile, but they can spontaneously smile if they're genuinely happy.